Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're taking a really deep plunge into your source material, covering the long and incredibly complex history of Algeria.
That's right. We've got quite a stack here. There's a broad historical overview, some sections focusing on ancient civilizations, the arrival of Islam, Ottoman
A
rule.
huge impact of French colonization, the intense war of independence.
Exactly. And then the post-independence period, the Civil War, which was devastating, and then also some specific articles looking at things like language, culture, foreign relations. It's a lot.
It really is. It's a huge sweep of time and change. So our mission today is to try and navigate all this rich material, pull out the most important nuggets of knowledge and insight, really.
Yeah, to give you a well-rounded understanding of Algeria's journey. It's gone through centuries of different influences, conflicts, and, this ongoing search for identity.
You can really see how these successive waves of people shape the land, can't you?
Absolutely. And how that long shadow of colonialism, well, it still influences the present in so many ways.
Yeah.
You'll see layers upon layers of history creating the picture we have today.
Definitely some surprising dynamics and recurring themes in these sources, I found.
For sure.
Okay, let's unpack this right from the beginning then. Your sources take us way, way back, finding human traces near Algiers incredibly early. What was it, 7500 BC?
Yeah, around then. Specifically Neolithic communities. Along the coastal areas, these people were, well, often described as Mediterranean. They were among the first there to practice agriculture, raising sheep and goats. And they used flint tools, made this distinctively decorated pottery.
And built those amazing stone structures, the dolmens, some weighing 10 tons, the sources said.
Incredible, isn't it? Moving stones like that back then.
So then things get, well, the sources say really interesting. Around 4500 BC, there are these migrations described coming from West Africa.
That's right. New populations arrive, and they bring new technologies like copper tools. They're also associated with a different physical type, sometimes called brachycephalic, basically, a shorter, broader head shape.
And the fascinating part is, even if these new groups weren't maybe as advanced in some ways,
Right.
the sources suggest they arrived in such huge numbers that they eventually kind of overwhelmed the earlier people.
Exactly. That's the picture painted.
Huh.
And the mixing of these two groups, the earlier Neolithic folk and these later arrivals, that's what the sources say really contributed to the makeup of, well, who we now know as the Berbers.
The original inhabitants.
The original inhabitants, yes. And they call themselves the Amazigh.
Which means free men, right? Powerful name.
Very powerful. And they developed their own civilization. The sources talk about settled tribes, actual cities. They list names like Kiranis, Zama, and Tara.
It mentioned these cities had pagan temples that later got repurposed for Christian worship. Interesting detail.
It is. And for a time, these Berber tribes achieved pretty significant political unity.
That state of Numidia.
Yes, Numidia. Yeah. Formed between the 9th and 8th centuries BC, covered a huge territory, something like 246,000 square miles, stretching from modern Morocco into Tunisia.
Wow.
Then, of course, come the Romans, intervention around 250 BC, after the Punic Wars.
And Roman Africa became massively important for Rome, didn't it? The breadbasket, basically. Grain, taxes.
Huge resource for them. And Roman civilization certainly spread the architecture, art, the Latin language.
But, and this seems key from the sources, the Latinization of the wider Berber population.
Yeah.
It wasn't really complete.
Exactly. That's a crucial insight. While the elite, particularly in the cities, they were quite receptive to Roman and Latin influence, maybe more so than in some Greek-influenced areas. The sources really emphasize that outside these urban centers, Roman rule was mostly about the land, the resources. It didn't fundamentally change the core Berber identity or language in the rural areas.
Okay, so fast forward centuries. We get to the 7th century, the arrival of Arab forces, Islam. They moved incredibly fast, didn't they? West across North Africa.
Incredibly fast. And they entered a region that, already had all these layers of influence. Berbers, earlier Arab traders, Jewish communities.
Right. So what was the immediate impact described in the sources?
Profound is the word used.
True.
It brought a new military religious law, a different sort of tribal social structure, and economically in some areas, it actually led to regression.
How so?
Well, those old trade routes connecting the Med, crossing the Sahara, they were disrupted. And many cities declined, some even disappeared entirely.
But the Berbers didn't just accept this passively.
Not at all. The sources talk about initial resistance, which then evolved into kind of self-defense and what they term a national revival among the Berbers. But despite that resistance, eventually the population was Islamized. They accepted the faith.
Okay.
However, the sources note something interesting. the adoption of the Arabic language.
Hmm.
That was met with less enthusiasm by some Berbers. Some saw it as, well, just another imposition.
So you get these conflicting feelings early on, faith versus language, maybe.
Sort of, yeah. These tensions emerge, and this era also sees really complex power dynamics, the rise of major dynasties.
Like the Almoravids and Almohads.
Exactly. Powerful Berber confederations building empires across North Africa, even into Spain. The sources also touch on Shiite figures arriving, gaining support among certain tribes like the Khedama. That led to the Fatimid Empire.
Right. And there were shifts within those dynasties, too.
Oh, definitely. Later, a Fatimid ruler, El-Moaz, he actually moved towards Sunni orthodoxy, which probably resonated more with the majority, but that caused conflict with other groups, like the Zirides.
And that led to that incredible event where the Fatimid Caliph in Cairo unleashed the Hilalian tribes.
Yes, basically sent these tribes from Arabia into the Maghreb as a kind of punishment for the Zirides' defiance. Caused huge disruption, according to the sources.
Wow. Okay, so moving forward again, we get to Ottoman rule. Starts with figures like Barbarossa conquering Algiers in 1516.
That's the start.
Yeah.
He conquers Algiers and pretty quickly places it under Ottoman protection, eventually authority.
Establishing the Regency of Algiers.
Right. Now, nominally, it's under the Ottoman Sultan, represented by a pashave or a dey. But the real power, the sources say, was local, with the dey and the military leadership, especially the Janissaries.
Those elite Ottoman infantry units.
Exactly. Their influence was so strong that the sources describe it for about 2 centuries as basically a sort of republic.
And this is also when piracy or corsairing becomes a major force, right?
Yeah.
The Barber Republic idea.
Yeah, a significant economic and political factor along the coast. But the sources do note that the Turks, despite that focus, maintained a generally competent bureaucracy, a relatively dignified rule, they call it, right up until 1830.
And there were attempts by Europeans to challenge Algiers.
Several. There's a striking detail about 1606. Internal conflict, a pasha made a deal with the Spanish. This weakness apparently allowed Spanish sailors into the city. They destroyed palaces, took captives, basically razed sections of it. Shows the vulnerability despite the supposed strength. So, given this long history, Ottomans included, it really begs the question, how did that Ottoman rule finally end?
Well, the sources are pretty clear. The French conquest in 1830, they suggest it was partly France's own imperial ambitions heating up at the time.
Right.
And maybe using the Pasha's focus on piracy as a kind of pretext or an opportunity.
But the invasion wasn't easy for the French, was it?
No, not at all. The conquest itself faced huge resistance, especially in those fiercely independent regions like the Kabylie Mountains and down south. But by 1848, France had formally incorporated Algeria, not just as a colony, but into France itself.
Which led to that massive influx of European settlers. French, yes, but others too. Farmers, workers, officials.
Creating what the sources call a finely wrought settler society.
Yeah, where these newcomers held pretty much all the political and economic power.
And the indigenous population, the Muslim Algerians.
Relegated. Secondary status. Often marginalized within what one source describes as a rigidly hierarchical and racist mosaic of administrations. Sounds pretty grim.
French policy was heavily geared towards assimilation, wasn't it?
Very much so. Actively discouraging traditional Islamic practice and knowledge.
Yeah.
Even forcibly modifying rural religious customs, apparently. And French became the language government, administration, education, actively hindering Arabic culture.
You can see how that would build resentment over time.
Absolutely. And it really started to boil over after World War II. You had over 100,000 Algerian soldiers who fought for France.
Right.
And there were promises made in 44. A kind of New Deal, greater rights. But the sources show the colonial administration just didn't deliver. Huge frustration, a real sense of betrayal.
And that led to tragedies like the protests in May 1945.
Yeah, peaceful demonstrations asking for rights met with just extreme violence. Sétif, May 8th, French police opened fire. Then soldiers ordered to shoot indiscriminately, burn villages.
The death toll estimates are staggering, anywhere from 6,000 up to 45,000.
It's a huge range, reflecting the chaos and brutality, just horrific.
So looking at the bigger picture of French rule, Algeria becomes this place with so many layers.
Exactly. Arab culture and language dominant for centuries, but Berber culture persists, especially strong in places like Kabylie. You still see the physical remnants too, Roman Phoenician ruins.
But then French rule brings rapid urbanization, the French language, French culture, particularly among the elite and settlers.
Right. And the sources highlight how Algerian nationalism really gathers steam after WWII, sets the stage for the conflict to come. It cements that complex linguistic landscape to Berber languages, various forms of Arabic and French, now the language of power.
That Arab versus Berber, French versus Arabic dynamic the sources mentioned seems crucial.
It's a recurring theme, reflecting those deep historical and cultural fault lines. And importantly, the sources really stress. Resistance wasn't new. It was a constant thread.
From local methods, like the Kabyles resisting even before 1830.
Through various revolts during the French occupation, all culminating in that major war for independence.
So what does this all mean then? It feels like the sources frame the Algerian War of Independence, kicking off in '54, as this massive, maybe inevitable eruption of all those simmering tensions, broken promises, and that long history of resistance.
That's exactly how it reads. November 1st, 1954. A coordinated armed uprising. Nationalist, regionalist groups coming together under the FLN banner, the National Liberation Front.
And they chose All Saints' Day strategically.
Seems so. Simultaneous attacks targeting French police, military infrastructure across the country.
Initially seemed isolated, maybe? Confusing?
Yeah, the sources say the French authorities initially tried to downplay it, just more overseas trouble. But concern grew fast, especially when attacks hit things like, believe it or not, tea supply routes.
Really? Tea?
Apparently. But within about a week, the sources say it was clear the FLN had gained real momentum, real belief in their cause.
Okay, so the immediate trigger was those attacks, but the deeper causes.
Much deeper, as the sources lay out. The failure of peaceful politics after WWII disappointments, inspiration from French, defeats elsewhere, Indochina, Vietnam, the huge economic gap between settlers and indigenous Algerians, and just years of built-up resentment, hatred. It's quite striking, one source notes, that initially there were even specific local grievances in some communities involved, suggests the drive was more national, systemic.
And the FLN's platform, unity, a non-capitalist future.
That was the emphasis. But the sources also point to internal contradictions. Big ones. They describe the FLN branding internal dissenters as traitors.
Leading to executions.
Yes, and using terror as a tool across the nation. It wasn't just directed outwards.
Looking at the war's aftermath, the sources mention this difficult legacy for France, a struggle to acknowledge the past.
Yeah, what's termed a French culture of forgetting, contrasted with an Algerian culture of remembering, where the war's trauma remains absolutely central.
And specific groups getting forgotten in France, the Harkis, the Pied Noirs.
Exactly. Algerians who fought for France, the French settlers, forgotten there. While Algerians felt their own disappeared and killed were erased from French narratives. Very different perspectives on memory.
And post-independence, Algeria steps onto the world stage quite prominently.
Oh, very much so. A key leader in the Third World struggle, maybe more than any other African nation then. Staunch supporter of the ANC, the PLO, chaired the non-aligned movement in the 70s.
Even supported Vietnam before diplomatic ties.
Yeah, providing donations, material aid.
Yeah.
Shows those connections, particularly with countries like China as well.
Okay, moving into that post-independence era, after July 5th, 1962, the birth of the nation sounds like it was challenging, violent in parts.
Definitely challenging. The sources note the huge difficulty in making that shift from a guerrilla movement, the FLN, to actually governing a nation effectively.
And one immediate consequence was clamping down on opposition.
Yeah, the sources are clear. The FLN administration allowed no room for other political voices. It initially adopted a style that sounded a bit like a Marxist-Leninist single-party state. Brief attempts at other parties shut down quickly. Underground movements started forming.
Beyond the politics, there's the cultural heritage aspect.
Right, a deep heritage. And the sources discuss this important effort to reckon with the past, including trying to repatriate cultural property scattered during colonialism and conflict.
Things from exhibitions, manuscripts that ended up in Europe.
Exactly, highlighting this ongoing work by organizations trying to bring that heritage back home.
Economically, though, a major theme seems to be the reliance on oil and gas, hydrocarbons.
Huge theme. Described as a rentier state, meaning the economy leans heavily on income from exporting those resources, not broad production.
Which makes it vulnerable, right? Like that oil price crash in 1986.
Precisely. The sources say that crash starkly highlighted the incompetence of the state's economic model back then. Just showed how exposed they were.
And the sources detail ongoing issues with state management, inefficiency, lack of transparency.
And crucially, a failure to really address social needs. Employment, healthcare, education, big gaps.
Leading to significant inequality.
Yeah, between regions, between households. And the sources warn this creates a real risk of social explosion. The state gets massive revenues from oil and gas, technically the people's resources, but that reliance, the argument goes, has diverted focus from tackling those major social problems. And this dynamic, this reliance on resource wealth instead of broader development, it leads into another really crucial period, which raises the question, what happens when, after maybe a brief political opening, things clamp down again?
Right. The sources describe that move towards multi-party democracy starting in 1989. But then, slam, January 1992. The military steps in, cancels the elections.
Elections that the Islamic Salvation Front, the FIS, had won.
Exactly. And that cancellation just plunged the country into...
Well, the sources call it the most violent and destructive chapter in modern Algerian history, the Civil War. Raging from 92 well into the late 90s. Brutal conflict. Government versus the FIS and other armed groups. Extreme violence, assassinations, horrific massacres.
The death toll estimates up to 200,000 people.
Just staggering. The sources call it the dark years. Grimly accurate, it seems.
And the causes? A power struggle, obviously, but more to it.
Definitely a fierce power struggle between the old FLN elite and the rising FIS. But crucially, deep fear among the ruling military and FLN circles about the FIS gaining actual power.
So the military intervention was primarily to protect their own status.
That's the argument in the sources, protecting their dominance, using the idea of sovereignty almost as a weapon to dismantle the rule of law and violently purge anyone they labeled Islamist.
And the sources draw a parallel here, don't they, between the FLN crushing opposition after independence and the military doing this in the 90s?
A stark parallel. In both cases, the argument goes, moderate voices got silenced. Actions driven by the sources use strong words, hatred, arrogance. They mention an unwritten history of this black decade. Reports still banned, journalists, academics silenced for trying to document it.
So the trajectory then goes from that violence, the dark years, 1999,
into an era of national reconciliation, 99 to 2009, some limited reforms. But then that leads into what the sources call political stagnation from 2009 onwards.
Fueling the discontent that led to the more recent protests, the Hirak.
Exactly. That simmering frustration eventually boiling over again. So bringing us right up to today. Algeria is, relatively speaking, a young nation, independent only since '62, but still grappling with these huge questions of identity, the legacies of that civil war, ongoing internal conflicts decades later.
And the sources really highlight these complex, often conflicting characteristics defining modern Algeria: fiercely anti-imperialist, patriotic, yet deeply divided socially and politically.
Right. Strong egalitarian ideals, but still that challenge of fully recognizing the Berber founding peoples, their language, a clear rejection of fundamentalism by many, but also this widespread desire for Islam to have a greater public role.
Aspiring to be a modern state, yet traditional structures still hold so much sway.
Which makes classifying it so hard, as the sources stress: authoritarian, fragile democracy, military state, rich country with protests, Islamic state. It just defies easy labels.
And recent events really underscore those tensions, those 1988 protests against the one-party system.
Yeah, chants like socialism's dead, down with the FLN, repressed, yes, but they fueled later calls for change. And of course, the ongoing Hirak protests demanding fundamental regime change.
Economically, the push towards a market economy, slow progress, still state-heavy.
Very much so. And that persistent reliance on hydrocarbons, that rentierism, it's still the core challenge. The sources even ask if maybe lower oil prices might finally force the reforms that high prices let the state avoid for so long.
Interesting thought. And civil society's role?
Crucial. A long history of resistance demanding democracy, justice. Even when repressed, CSOs adapted, contributing hugely to the Hirak's momentum against that entrenched power structure.
That FLN military state triad the sources mention.
Deeply rooted, inheriting colonial history, fueled by resource wealth. The sources point out how this leadership historically benefited from controlling key sectors, oil, gas, big projects, often linked back to old French monopolies.
And briefly on foreign relations again, a shift after the Cold War.
A bit, yeah. From that strong unilateral stance supporting liberation struggles to maybe a more liberal approach, trying to improve ties with neighbors, engage the EU. But tensions remain, especially with Morocco. The sources suggest Morocco has seen Algeria as a threat since way back in 1830, opposing its role in things like the Western Sahara. So yeah, that's a vast, vast history we've tried to navigate in this deep dive. From those earliest inhabitants, successive empires, through that profound, often brutal rupture of French colonization.
The violent fight for independence, the huge challenges of building a nation afterwards, the devastating internal conflicts.
And this ongoing search for identity, for stability, right into the 21st century. It's quite a journey.
It really is. A history just packed with complexity. Cycles of influence, resistance, conflict. Some key takeaways from your sources seem to be those deep, ancient roots of resistance, the lasting, complicated impact of colonization, especially on identity and language,
Definitely.
that troubling, cyclical nature of conflict and repression that seems to keep recurring, those parallels drawn between different eras,
Hmm.
and of course, that persistent economic challenge, the dependence on oil and gas wealth.
Absolutely. And this history, while it's Algeria's specific story, it really does offer compelling insights into the challenges so many post-colonial nations face. That incredibly intricate dance between culture, language, economics, politics, and the long-term fallout when external forces and internal divisions clash.
The sources we explored today, they seem to suggest Algeria's path has often felt, I don't know, scripted by outsiders or maybe derailed by internal toxicity, internal conflict. So given its deep past, its incredibly complex present, what kind of future can Algeria script for itself? It leaves you wondering, doesn't it, about the potential for change, for resolution amidst all these enduring challenges.